Welcome to the videos on Spring4Shell. This course will be covered in 3 videos. The first one will introduce you to Spring4Shell. The second one will then help you set up the vulnerability in NCL's testbed. And the third one will show you how you can see a live simulation of the vulnerability in NCL's testbed. This is the first video of the series where we will give you an introduction to the vulnerability. So, what is Spring4Shell and where did it come from? Spring4Shell is a vulnerability endemic to the web service made by Spring Java framework. But what is Spring Framework? Spring Framework is a web development framework produced and maintained by VMware, a cloud computing company. Spring Framework, and by extension Java, use virtual objects to model a system. This is a specific paradigm of programming called object-oriented programming. An object can be anything that is uniquely existing in the virtual system, from a picture, a graphic, to a collection of data, or even code. Spring Framework is quite popular due to its cross-platform and multi-language support. As a result, many web services contain Spring Framework, which makes it easy to build Java applications. All these web services become particularly vulnerable to the Spring4Shell exploit. Before we proceed to the exploit, we need to understand a key concept of modern web development: data binding. Data binding is a widely used technique in web services that help bind virtual objects. This binding will ensure that whatever changes that happen to an object on one side will be reflected in the other object. Data binding is widely used in user interface programming and data manipulation applications, as it ensures that the objects from both sides are synchronized and symmetric. Now, let's try to understand how the exploit works. A hacker can use the data binding functionality in the Spring framework to his advantage. To do this, the hacker tries to establish a binding with an object that is already present in the web service. A hacker doesn't need to have an object on his side. As long as the Spring framework is tricked into thinking that it has established a bind with the actual object from the user side, the exploit can continue. Once the binding has been established, the hacker can use request mapping method to append code into the virtual object inside the web server. As implied by the name, this function will request to map any change that occurs in one object to the other. The Spring framework will interpret this as a genuine request to update the object in the server side to match with the user side object, so it will run the command without hesitation. This form of attack is known as remote code execution, or RCE attack, where the hacker injects malicious code into a machine that is vulnerable. Once the RCE is established on the compromised machine, it can further lead to more cyber attacks. The hacker might get access to the website's backend, database, or even the host's credentials. The simple presence of the Spring4Shell vulnerability in a machine is not enough for hackers to exploit it with RCE. The app being targeted must also run on Tomcat as a web archive WAR deployment. As such, the impact of Spring4Shell is not as severe as Log4Shell, and even the scope of apps or servers it can affect is small. Regardless, the vulnerability is concerning, and it is something cybersecurity professionals have actively responded to. This is all for the introduction to Spring4Shell. In the next video, we will be moving on to setting up the vulnerability in NCL's testbed. See you in the next video!